One of the most misunderstood outcomes of healing is the belief that it makes an empath cold or distant, when in reality it makes them selective, and that difference changes every relationship they enter. Before healing, emotional access was often unlimited. The empath listened without limits, gave without measuring cost, and stayed emotionally available even when it drained them. Intimacy was offered freely, sometimes desperately, because connection felt like safety. But healing introduces awareness. The empath begins to notice how much energy is exchanged in emotional closeness and how often they were giving without being met. Carl Jung emphasized that maturity of the psyche requires boundaries between the self and the external world. A healed empath finally develops those boundaries not as walls, but as gates. Emotional closeness becomes intentional rather than automatic. They no longer invite everyone into their inner world. They no longer confuse availability with love. This shift feels subtle on the inside, but dramatic on the outside. The empath still cares, still listens, still feels deeply, but they regulate emotional intimacy. They choose when to engage, when to step back, and when silence is healthier than explanation. This regulation is deeply unsettling to narcissistic personalities because their sense of security depends on unrestricted access to another person's emotional world. Unlimited access allows them to provoke, drain, reassure themselves, and regain control whenever they feel unstable. When that access is revoked, panic sets in. The healed empath no longer responds instantly, no longer absorbs emotional chaos, and no longer offers endless reassurance. There is space now, and space removes leverage. Jung warned that individuation would disrupt relational dynamics built on unconscious dependency. When the empath stops over, giving, the imbalance becomes visible. Conversations shorten. Emotional labor is no longer performed automatically. The empath may appear distant, but internally they feel calmer, clearer, and more grounded than ever before. They are not withdrawing love, they are protecting energy. Emotional access becomes something earned through respect, consistency, and reciprocity. This is not punishment, it is self-respect, and it creates a quiet power shift. Those who relied on constant emotional availability feel abandoned, even though nothing cruel has occurred. The empath is simply no longer accessible on demand. They are present without being consumed. Jung described this as the emergence of the self, the point where a person relates to others without losing themselves. The healed empath no longer merges emotionally to feel connected. They remain whole while engaging, and this wholeness is what makes manipulation ineffective. There is no longer an open door to walk through uninvited, no endless emotional supply to tap into, no urgency to explain or soothe discomfort. The empath's selectivity is not defensive, it is conscious. They give where there is mutual care, and they step back where there is entitlement. Healing doesn't harden the empath's heart. It teaches them that access is sacred, not free, and that true intimacy requires respect on both sides. One of the clearest signs of a healed empath is not louder strength or sharper words, but a quiet internal shift from reacting to observing, and this change alters every emotional dynamic around them. Before healing, reactions happened automatically. A tone of voice could trigger anxiety, silence could spark overthinking, and provocation could pull emotional responses out of them before they even realized it. Their nervous system was constantly scanning for emotional cues, trying to maintain harmony or prevent abandonment. Carl Jung described this state as unconscious identification, where a person is merged with their emotions rather than aware of them. Healing introduces distance, not disconnection, but clarity. The empath begins to notice emotions without becoming them. Feelings arise, but they are observed rather than obeyed. This is what Jung called individuation, the process of separating the self from unconscious patterns and reclaiming inner authority. A healed empath feels anger without exploding, sadness without collapsing, and discomfort without rushing to fix it. They pause, they watch, they choose. This pause is deeply destabilizing to narcissistic personalities because provocation depends entirely on emotional reaction. Narcissists regulate their power through visible impact, confusion, guilt, anger, reassurance. When the empath no longer reacts, the feedback loop breaks, the insult lands nowhere, the silent treatment loses its threat, emotional bait goes untouched. The healed empath is still aware of what is happening, but they are no longer pulled into the performance. Jung warned that consciousness dissolves manipulation because it removes the unconscious hooks. The empath no longer argues to be understood or reacts to defend their reality. Observation replaces defense. This does not mean passivity. it means discernment. The healed empath sees patterns clearly because they are no longer emotionally entangled inside them. They recognize manipulation as behavior rather than personal failure. Their calm becomes unsettling, not because it is cold, but because it is unresponsive to chaos. Narcissists often escalate when observation replaces reaction, searching for the emotional switch that no longer works. But the empath does not mirror intensity anymore. They remain grounded, aware, and internally stable. Jung described this state as psychological adulthood, the moment a person stops being ruled by unconscious emotional reflexes. The healed empath does not suppress feelings, they hold them consciously. Silence becomes intentional rather than fearful. Words become measured rather than reactive. Decisions are made from clarity instead of urgency. This shift changes the power dynamic completely. Without reaction, there is no control. Without emotional charge, there is no leverage. The empath is no longer predictable through pain points. They are present without being penetrable. Observation gives them freedom. They see what is happening without losing themselves inside it. And this is why healed empaths appear untouchable. Not because they no longer feel, but because they finally feel without being controlled by what they feel. One of the most powerful yet least understood transformations a healed empath undergoes is not the loss of compassion, but its refinement, because healing does not strip empathy away. It teaches the empath where it belongs and where it does not. Before healing, compassion often flowed without limits. The empath felt responsible for other people's pain, moods, and emotional stability. They listened endlessly, forgave quickly, and stayed long past the point of exhaustion, believing that love meant endurance and understanding meant self-sacrifice. Compassion was confused with tolerance, and tolerance slowly became self-betrayal. Carl Jung warned that when empathy is not balanced by consciousness, it becomes a shadow trait, something that looks virtuous on the surface but quietly erodes the self. Healing changes this dynamic completely. The empath begins to recognize that compassion without boundaries is not kindness. It is abandonment of the self. This realization is not sudden or dramatic. It arrives slowly, often after repeated emotional injuries, broken trust, and the painful awareness that giving more has never healed anyone who refuses to take responsibility for themselves. As the empath heals, compassion becomes conscious. They still feel deeply, but they no longer absorb everything they feel. They learn to distinguish between understanding someone's pain and carrying it. Jung described this as the differentiation of the self from the other. The moment a person can relate without merging, boundaries emerge not as walls, but as clarity. The healed empath no longer explains their limits excessively or apologizes for needing space. They understand that boundaries do not punish others, they protect inner balance. This refined compassion immediately disrupts trauma bond cycles. Trauma bonds thrive on inconsistency, guilt, overgiving, and emotional confusion. The empath's unguarded compassion once fueled these bonds because it allowed emotional exploitation to masquerade as connection. When compassion gains boundaries, the bond loses its grip. The empath no longer stays to prove loyalty, no longer tolerates harm in the name of understanding, and no longer believes love requires suffering. Emotional exploitation collapses because it depends on access without accountability. The healed empath now offers care selectively. They listen without fixing. They support without rescuing. They care without chasing. Jung emphasized that maturity of the psyche requires the courage to disappoint others in order to remain faithful to oneself. This courage becomes visible in the healed empath's presence. They are warm but firm, kind but unyielding, open yet discerning. Their compassion now includes themselves. They notice when interactions drain rather than nourish. They step back without guilt. They recognize that some people are attached to their empathy, not to them as a whole person. This awareness is deeply unsettling to those who benefited from their self-betrayal. Emotional manipulators often accuse the healed empath of becoming selfish, distant, or cold. But this accusation reveals the loss of access, not a loss of care. Compassion with boundaries does not negotiate with manipulation. It does not respond to guilt trips or emotional pressure. It remains steady and unmoved. Jung described this steadiness as inner authority, the point where values are internally anchored rather than externally dictated. The healed empath no longer proves their goodness through endurance. They no longer stay in conversations that feel unsafe. They no longer confuse empathy with obligation. This shift ends the unconscious contract that trauma bonds rely on. Without overgiving, there is no imbalance to exploit. Without self-sacrifice, there is no leverage. Without emotional confusion, there is no hook. The empath's compassion now flows where there is reciprocity, respect, and emotional responsibility. This refinement brings a quiet strength. The empath becomes emotionally present without being consumable. They can witness pain without being pulled into it. They can love without losing themselves. Jung believed that wholeness emerges when a person integrates love with limits, feeling with structure, openness with containment. This integration transforms compassion from a vulnerability into a grounded force. The healed empath no longer bleeds for connection. They no longer chase understanding from those unwilling to give it. Their compassion no longer costs them their peace. And this is why emotional exploitation fails in their presence. There is nothing to drain, nothing to guilt, nothing to twist. Compassion remains, but it is guided by self-respect. It becomes strength rather than sacrifice. It becomes clarity rather than confusion. And in this state, the empath does not harden, they stabilize. They stand rooted in themselves, able to care deeply without disappearing, able to love without self-betrayal, and able to walk away from dynamics that demand their pain as proof of loyalty. This is not less empathy. It is empathy that finally includes the self, and that inclusion changes everything. One of the most unsettling shifts that occurs when an empath truly heals is not visible strength or outward confidence, but an inner comfort with being misunderstood, a change Carl Jung explicitly warned would accompany individuation. Before healing, the empath often lived in a constant state of self-explanation. They clarified their intentions, justified their feelings, softened their words, and over-communicated their motives, all in an effort to be seen accurately and not be perceived as cruel, selfish, or wrong. Being misunderstood felt dangerous. It triggered guilt, anxiety, and an urgent need to correct the narrative. The empath believed that if they could just explain better, stay calmer, or show more compassion, they would be understood and harmony would return. But healing dismantles this illusion. Jung taught that individuation separates a person from collective expectations and unconscious agreements. As the empath becomes more whole, they naturally step out of roles others assign to them, and this inevitably leads to misunderstanding. The healed empath begins to realize that many people were never confused by them, they were invested in a version of the empath that served their needs. Explanation once functioned as a form of self-defense, an attempt to manage how others felt, but healing removes this compulsion. The empath no longer feels responsible for correcting every false assumption or soothing every discomfort their boundaries create. Silence replaces defense. Not because the empath has nothing to say, but because they finally understand that clarity offered to those committed to misunderstanding is wasted energy. Jung described this stage as psychological maturity, where a person no longer measures their worth through external validation or collective approval. The healed empath speaks when it is meaningful and remains silent when words would only invite manipulation. This silence is deeply unsettling to those who relied on guilt, confusion, and emotional pressure to maintain control. Without explanations, there is nothing to twist. Without justification, there is nothing to argue against. The empath's quiet presence exposes the motives of others without accusation. Those accustomed to provoking emotional reactions often escalate when silence appears, attempting to re-establish the old dynamic. But the healed empath no longer rushes to repair discomfort that is not theirs to fix. They understand that misunderstanding does not equal injustice, and being misread does not require correction. Jung warned that individuation isolates because it removes a person from unconscious participation in collective illusions. The healed empath feels this isolation not as loneliness, but as clarity. They stop trying to be emotionally accessible to everyone. They accept that depth will be misinterpreted as coldness, boundaries as cruelty, and self-respect as selfishness. And instead of fighting these labels, they let them exist. This is not indifference, it is discernment. The empath has learned that explaining themselves often kept them trapped in cycles of emotional labor where clarity was demanded but never honored. Healing teaches them that peace does not require agreement. The need to be understood dissolves because self-understanding has solidified. Jung believed that when the self becomes internally anchored, external misunderstanding loses its power to destabilize. The healed empath no longer performs goodness to be perceived as good. They no longer chase fairness in the eyes of those who benefit from confusion. Silence becomes a boundary, not a punishment. It communicates finality without hostility. It marks the end of emotional negotiation. Those who once relied on the empath's explanations feel threatened, because explanation provided access. It opened doors to debate, guilt, and control. Silence closes those doors gently but firmly. The empath is no longer available for character trials or emotional cross-examinations. They understand that not everyone deserves access to their inner world. Jung described this acceptance as the cost of becoming oneself. The healed empath pays this cost willingly, because the alternative is a life spent defending a truth that was never truly heard. They choose inner alignment over external approval. They choose peace over perception. And in doing so, they become comfortable standing alone in their truth, even when misunderstood. This comfort does not harden them, it stabilizes them. They remain kind without explaining, firm without justifying, and present without proving. Misunderstanding loses its threat because it no longer defines them. They know who they are. And that knowing makes silence powerful, isolation bearable, and manipulation impossible. When an empath truly heals, something subtle yet powerful happens that cannot be taught, forced, or imitated. Their presence alone begins to reveal truth, without confrontation, explanation, or accusation. Carl Jung spoke of psychological clarity as a natural result of individuation, the process by which a person becomes internally aligned rather than divided. A healed empath carries this alignment quietly. They no longer leak confusion, self-doubt, or emotional urgency into the room. Their inner world is settled enough that it stops asking others to define it. This calm is not passive, and it is not empty. It is coherent. And coherence has an unexpected effect on people who are not at peace with themselves. When someone unresolved enters the presence of a healed empath, the contrast becomes unavoidable. The empath does not expose anyone intentionally. They do not analyze, accuse, or diagnose. They simply remain grounded, and in that groundedness, unresolved wounds in others begin to surface. Jung believed that what remains unconscious seeks expression, especially when mirrored by consciousness. The healed empath becomes that mirror, not by reflecting behavior, but by embodying clarity. Their calm makes emotional chaos visible. Their steadiness highlights instability. Their silence draws attention to manipulation. This is why narcissistic personalities feel exposed around healed empaths, even when nothing is said. Narcissists rely on projection, confusion, and emotional distortion to maintain control. They create narratives, provoke reactions, and shift blame to stay psychologically dominant. But in the presence of someone who is internally whole, these tactics lose their camouflage. The healed empath does not react with defensiveness or compliance. They do not rush to fill silence or soothe discomfort. They do not argue reality. Their lack of reaction removes the smokescreen. Without emotional noise, truth becomes louder. Jung taught that clarity threatens the ego because it dissolves illusion. The narcissist feels seen, not because the empath is watching closely, but because there is nowhere left to hide. The empath's presence does not validate false narratives or emotional manipulation. It does not collapse under guilt or pressure. It simply remains stable. This stability forces others to confront themselves. Unresolved shame, insecurity, and fear rise to the surface, often expressed as irritation, hostility, or sudden withdrawal. The narcissist may accuse the empath of being judgmental, cold, or distant, but these accusations reveal discomfort, not wrongdoing. The healed empath is not doing anything to provoke exposure. They are simply no longer participating in distortion. Jung described this phenomenon as the dissolving effect of consciousness. When one person becomes conscious, it disrupts unconscious agreements. The healed empath no longer plays the role of emotional regulator, rescuer, or mirror for someone else's fragile self-image. They do not absorb projected blame. They do not correct falsehoods aggressively. Their calm allows reality to stand on its own. This creates a quiet pressure. Truth does not need to be spoken when it is felt. The empath's presence carries psychological integrity, and integrity naturally highlights inconsistency. Those who rely on emotional games feel unsettled because their strategies are no longer effective. Provocation goes unanswered. Victimhood receives no emotional reward. Charm meets neutrality. The healed empath does not expose lies, they make lying uncomfortable. Jung warned that individuation would isolate individuals because clarity disrupts social masks. The healed empath experiences this not as superiority, but as distance. People who are committed to illusion drift away, not because they are rejected, but because coherence is confronting. The empath remains open, but no longer collapses to maintain harmony. They allow discomfort to exist without rescuing it. This is why narcissists often feel attacked in silence. Their internal fragmentation is reflected back by the empath's wholeness. There is no accusation to argue with, no emotion to hijack, no narrative to twist. The exposure happens internally. The narcissist senses the loss of control and interprets it as threat. Jung believed that the psyche resists integration when confronted with truth it cannot control. The healed empath becomes a living reminder that emotional stability does not require dominance, that worth does not require manipulation, and that power does not require control. This reminder is deeply uncomfortable to those who survive through distortion. The empath's presence is not confrontational, but it is uncompromising. It does not bend reality to protect fragile egos. It does not dim itself to make others comfortable. It simply exists in alignment, and alignment has consequences. Truth rises without words, masks slip without accusation, wounds surface without intention. The healed empath does not expose anyone, they stop covering for them. And in that absence of cover, reality speaks for itself. One of the most profound transformations a healed empath experiences is the ability to walk away from situations, relationships, and people that caused harm without seeking closure, explanation, or validation. And this act is not a sign of avoidance, but of ultimate inner power. Before healing, empaths often felt compelled to seek understanding, reassurance, or some form of acknowledgement from those who hurt them. They believed that without answers, forgiveness, or an apology, the emotional loop would remain open, their peace unattainable, and their sense of self incomplete. They replayed interactions, dissected conversations, and attempted to resolve what was never theirs to fix, exhausting themselves emotionally in the process. Carl Jung emphasized the importance of inner completion, the moment when a person no longer depends on external validation to feel whole. For the healed empath, this principle becomes a lived reality. Walking away without closure is not indifference. It is a conscious acknowledgement that some people, some circumstances, and some patterns cannot provide the understanding or repair once sought. The empath no longer gives energy to reconstruct narratives that never aligned with truth or mutual care. They understand that closure is not something the outside world can give. It is something they cultivate internally. Peace does not arrive through apologies or recognition from others. It emerges from self-reconciliation, from integrating experiences, lessons, and emotions without needing the perpetrator's participation. Jung described this as individuation, the process by which one differentiates the self from the projections, expectations, and manipulations of the external world. The healed empath realizes that waiting for closure from those who harmed them only perpetuates dependency, suffering, and unresolved cycles. Walking away becomes a deliberate act of sovereignty, a silent declaration that emotional equilibrium belongs within, not in the hands of those who once destabilized them. This act is deeply unsettling to individuals who relied on the empath's need for resolution to maintain control. Narcissists, manipulators, and emotional exploiters are particularly impacted because their influence depends on unfinished emotional business. They provoke, gaslight, or withhold acknowledgement, creating an illusion of imbalance to keep the empath engaged. When the empath disengages without argument, without insistence, and without seeking explanations, the manipulative structure collapses. The power dynamic shifts quietly but irrevocably. Jung suggested that completion occurs when the psyche stops negotiating with shadows outside itself and turns inward for reconciliation. The healed empath embodies this principle. They may feel sadness, regret, or even anger about what happened, but these feelings are observed and processed internally, not used as fuel to reopen old wounds or demand justification. This internal resolution is far more lasting than any external apology could provide. Walking away without closure is also an act of emotional literacy. It reflects a clear understanding of boundaries, self-worth, and the limits of responsibility. The empath recognizes what belongs to them and what belongs to others. They stop trying to force emotional transactions that cannot be fulfilled and stop sacrificing their well-being for the illusion of resolution. Jung warned that true maturity isolates because it removes the individual from relational patterns built on unconscious contracts and dependency. The healed empath experiences this isolation as freedom rather than loneliness. They do not require recognition from those who caused harm because they have recognized themselves. They do not linger in toxic dynamics in the hope of fairness or acknowledgement, because fairness is irrelevant when integrity is preserved internally. Walking away becomes a declaration of sovereignty that is both quiet and absolute. It communicates boundaries without confrontation and integrity without explanation. For the empath, closure is internal peace, not an external conversation. This act teaches a profound lesson to others that emotional power is rooted not in persuasion or validation, but in self-possession. The healed empath does not punish or seek revenge. They simply step into wholeness and leave what no longer serves them behind. And in that act, there is a strength so subtle, yet so unmistakable, that those accustomed to controlling, manipulating, or exploiting empaths often feel powerless, exposed, and unsettled. Walking away without closure is not a denial of experience. It is the acknowledgement that some narratives do not need completion to be meaningful. The empath carries the lessons, integrates the pain, and continues forward with clarity. Jung described this as the culmination of individuation, the point at which one's life is no longer governed by the unfinished business of others, but guided by the inner compass of self-awareness. In the presence of this calm, self-contained power, former manipulators and critics are left with only reflection, unable to provoke the response they once relied on. The healed empath's departure is silent but potent, peaceful but transformative, and this is the final act of psychological sovereignty, the choice to prioritize internal completion over external validation, to step away without argument, to reclaim energy that was once drained, and to stand whole, independent, and untouchable in the face of what once caused them pain. Most people think healing makes an empath softer, quieter, or easier to deal with, but Carl Jung revealed a truth that makes many uncomfortable. When an empath truly heals, something unexpected happens. They stop chasing understanding, they stop explaining their pain, they stop reacting the way people are used to. And suddenly, the same individuals who once felt powerful around them, especially narcissists, begin to feel uneasy, threatened, even exposed. This video isn't about becoming cold or heartless. It's about what happens when empathy meets wholeness, when compassion gains boundaries, and when emotional access is no longer free. Jung called this individuation, the moment you become whole within yourself. And once that happens, manipulation stops working. Guilt loses its grip. Silence becomes louder than arguments. By the end of this video, you may realize why some people drifted away once you started healing, and why that wasn't a loss at all. If this already feels uncomfortably accurate, stay with me till the end. And if you've lived this shift, don't just watch, leave a comment. Someone reading it may finally understand what they're going through. Subscribe quietly like a signal to yourself you're ready for the next level. A healed empath reaches a moment Carl Jung described as the end of the inner split, and this moment quietly changes everything. Before healing, the empath often lives divided, one part deeply intuitive and compassionate, the other constantly questioning their worth through the eyes of others. They feel deeply, but they also seek confirmation that their feelings matter. Validation becomes a survival language. Approval soothes the nervous system. Reassurance feels like safety, but healing closes this split. The empath no longer looks outward to decide who they are or whether they are enough. Something settles inside them, not loudly, not dramatically, but firmly. They begin to trust their own inner experience without needing it echoed back. Jung believed that wholeness emerges when a person withdraws projection from the external world and reclaims authority over their inner life. For the healed empath, this means attention from others stops being a requirement. Praise no longer defines them. Disapproval no longer destabilizes them. Silence from others does not trigger panic. And this is where the shift becomes deeply uncomfortable for certain people. Narcissistic personalities depend on attention as a form of control. They regulate their sense of power through reactions, emotional responses, and reassurance loops. When an empath stops seeking validation, the narcissist loses leverage. There is nothing to pull, nothing to withhold, nothing to reward or punish. The empath's independence collapses the entire control structure. Conversations change. The healed empath no longer over-explains, over-apologizes, or anxiously waits for emotional feedback. They speak clearly, or they remain silent without tension. Their calm is not performative, it is rooted. Jung warned that individuation would make people appear distant, even intimidating, not because they lack feeling, but because they are no longer fragmented. A healed empath does not need to be chosen, approved, or understood to feel secure. Their self-worth is internally anchored. This creates a strange reversal of power. Those who once felt dominant now feel invisible. Those who thrived on emotional dependency now feel irrelevant. And the empath does not do this intentionally. There is no revenge, no strategy, no coldness. It is simply the natural result of becoming whole. Attention is no longer currency. Emotional energy is no longer leaked. Validation becomes internal, quiet, steady. Jung called this maturity of the psyche, the point where the self no longer begs the world to confirm its existence. For the healed empath, this is freedom. And for those who relied on their neediness, it is deeply unsettling. Because when validation is no longer sought, control no longer works, and the empath finally stands as an individual rather than a mirror for someone else's power. Carl Jung taught that true healing does not come from becoming more positive, kinder, or spiritually elevated on the surface, but from integrating the shadow, the parts of ourselves we were taught to hide, fear, or reject. For the empath, this truth is especially uncomfortable. Empaths are often conditioned to suppress anger, soften boundaries, and remain emotionally available at all costs. They learn early that being loving means being accommodating, that being good means being quiet about their pain, and that expressing anger risks abandonment. But healing reverses this pattern. A healed empath no longer runs from their shadow, they turn toward it with awareness. They begin to understand that anger is not cruelty, boundaries are not rejection, and silence is not punishment. These traits, once feared, become tools of balance. Jung believed the shadow contains vital life energy, and when it is suppressed, it does not disappear. It leaks out unconsciously, often through exhaustion, resentment, or self-betrayal. When the empath integrates their shadow, that leakage stops. They no longer feel guilty for saying no. They no longer explain their limits excessively. Their anger becomes clean, precise, and brief rather than buried and explosive. This integration creates psychological wholeness. The empath is no longer split between who they are and who they think they must be to be loved. And this is where manipulation loses its power. Manipulation depends on fear, fear of conflict, fear of disapproval, fear of abandonment. A healed empath no longer fears these things because they have already faced the parts of themselves that once scared them. They are no longer startled by their own intensity or strength. Silence becomes a conscious choice rather than a defensive reaction. Boundaries become steady instead of emotional ultimatums. Jung warned that people who integrate their shadow often appear intimidating, not because they are aggressive, but because they are no longer predictable. The healed empath cannot be guilted into overgiving, cannot be provoked into emotional chaos, and cannot be shamed into compliance. Their presence carries a quiet authority. They do not threaten, explain, or justify. They simply are. This balance between light and shadow makes them psychologically whole. Compassion exists alongside firmness. Sensitivity exists alongside strength. And because of this integration, manipulation has nowhere to land. There is no suppressed anger to poke, no ignored boundary to cross repeatedly, no fear to exploit. The empath no longer reacts from old wounds. They respond from awareness. Jung described this as the birth of the self, the moment when a person becomes internally unified rather than divided against themselves. For the healed empath, this is not a loss of kindness, but a refinement of it. Their empathy becomes discerning, their generosity becomes intentional, and their energy becomes protected. And for those who once relied on their self-suppression, this change feels threatening. Not because the empath has become harmful, but because they have become whole, and wholeness cannot be controlled. The ultimate and most uncomfortable truth that Carl Jung revealed about human psychology is that wholeness cannot be controlled. And when an empath reaches true wholeness, they become untouchable in a way that is both quiet and undeniable. Before healing, empaths are vulnerable because they carry inner gaps, unresolved emotions, self-doubt, the longing for validation, and the need to be seen, understood, or loved. These missing pieces create openings that others, particularly narcissists or manipulators, instinctively exploit. Emotional hijacking, guilt, and domination all find a home where completeness is absent because fragmented people unconsciously signal need, dependence, and access. Healing fills those gaps through self-awareness, introspection, and the integration of shadow elements. The empath reconstructs their internal landscape, reclaiming energy that was once dispersed in endless reactions, self-blame, or overachieving. Jung called this individuation the moment the psyche stops being split between unconscious drives and conscious awareness. When an empath reaches this stage, their wholeness acts as a natural shield. They no longer react impulsively, they no longer chase approval, and they no longer overextend to maintain connection. Their sense of self is internally anchored, independent of other people's moods, manipulation, or attempts at control. This is what makes them untouchable. Their presence is no longer a gateway for exploitation. Their emotions cannot be hijacked because they are fully conscious and regulated. Their decisions are no longer influenced by guilt, obligation, or fear because those triggers have lost their power. Jung emphasized that psychological wholeness is not arrogance, detachment, or emotional coldness, it is integration. The healed empath is still deeply feeling, still compassionate, and still connected, but those qualities are balanced with awareness, boundaries, and self-possession. They can give freely, but not indiscriminately. They can love fully, but not destructively. They can engage emotionally, but never at the cost of their integrity. This equilibrium is profoundly disorienting to people who previously relied on controlling the empath. Narcissists, manipulators, and emotional exploiters are accustomed to entering a space where they can create tension, provoke reactions, and leverage dependency. The empath's reactions, confusion, and over-giving once provided them fuel and access. Wholeness removes that access entirely. When an empath becomes untouchable, attempts at guilt, shame, or coercion fail silently. Words intended to manipulate no longer resonate. Emotional provocation does not trigger old patterns. The power to destabilize is gone because the empath is internally complete. Jung suggested that the psyche's awareness dissolves external control by removing unconscious openings. When the empath is whole, there is simply nothing left to exploit. This untouchable state is not about isolation, although it may feel isolating to those who cannot meet the empath on equal footing. It is about self-containment, the ability to exist fully without needing external validation, approval, or emotional reinforcement. The healed empath embodies a psychological immunity, an internal sovereignty that radiates subtly but unmistakably. Others may feel unsettled or even threatened, not because harm is being done, but because the empath's wholeness silently exposes their attempts at manipulation. The gap between completeness and fragmentation becomes obvious in interactions. Where once chaos, guilt, and projection could dictate the relationship, now clarity, boundaries, and conscious presence set the tone. This is the ultimate uncomfortable truth: wholeness cannot be dominated. The healed empath's energy is unified, their intentions clear, and their emotional state self-contained. They no longer participate unconsciously in cycles of overgiving, people-pleasing, or reactionary responses. Control over them is impossible not because they resist, but because there is no internal leverage remaining. Jung emphasized that the conscious self, once fully integrated, changes the dynamics of every interaction simply by existing in alignment. The empath's calm, steady presence communicates strength without aggression, awareness without accusation, and autonomy without separation. Their relationships become healthier, not by confrontation, but by the natural order of wholeness. Those who once thrived on dependency, guilt, or confusion feel the absence of control intensely because the empath's completeness cannot be borrowed, stolen, or coerced. The healed empath operates from a center of integrity that is impervious to outside influence. This does not mean they are detached or unfeeling. On the contrary, their compassion deepens because it is given freely rather than demanded or manipulated. Their emotional intelligence is refined, their energy protected, and their choices deliberate. Jung described this as the maturation of the psyche, the ultimate stage where the individual no longer seeks permission to exist as themselves, and where their internal resources provide all that is necessary for balance, peace, and self-actualization. The empath's untouchability is therefore both psychological and relational. It allows them to engage without merging, to care without overextending, and to navigate life without yielding power to those who would exploit incompleteness. They have become whole, and in that wholeness lies a quiet yet absolute freedom. Nothing inside them is missing, and because nothing is missing, no external force can destabilize them. They are untouchable, not by aggression, not by avoidance, but by the simple, undeniable fact that they are complete. One of the most transformative and, for outsiders, surprising changes that occurs when an empath heals is their ability to stop playing the savior role, a pattern that, consciously or unconsciously, had dominated much of their emotional life. Before healing, empaths often carried the burden of responsibility for other people's emotions, decisions, and well-being. They believed, sometimes without realizing it, that their love, understanding, or effort could fix situations, heal pain, or redeem those who had caused harm. This compulsion is rooted in what Jung described as unconscious archetypes: the rescuer, the redeemer, and the nurturer, all of which carry enormous psychological energy but are only sustainable when balanced by awareness and boundaries. When an empath unconsciously assumes the savior role, they are constantly giving beyond their capacity, sacrificing personal peace to repair someone else's world, and ultimately providing fuel to individuals who thrive on dependency, manipulation, or control. Narcissists, in particular, instinctively recognize this pattern. They know that the empath's need to save, fix, or redeem is a perfect hook. Emotional manipulation thrives on this dynamic because it ensures that the empath remains invested, reactive, and vulnerable. Healing changes this dynamic fundamentally. Through introspection, self-awareness, and integration of shadow elements, the empath begins to recognize the limits of their responsibility and the boundaries of what they can and cannot influence. They realize that attempting to fix someone else's life at the cost of their own emotional equilibrium is not kindness, it is self-betrayal. Jung emphasized that individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires separating the self from unconscious patterns projected onto the external world. For the healed empath, this means that the instinct to rescue is transformed into conscious compassion. They still care, still feel deeply, and still offer support where it is appropriate, but their energy is no longer spent repairing or redeeming someone else's fractured sense of self. This shift has profound effects on interpersonal dynamics. Narcissists and manipulators, who once relied on the empath's unconscious savior tendencies to maintain control, suddenly find that the rules of engagement have changed. The hooks that once elicited compliance, guilt, or overinvestment are no longer effective. Attempts to provoke emotional overextension are met with calm observation rather than frantic response. Appeals to guilt or shame are met with quiet discernment rather than immediate sacrifice. In essence, the healed empath's withdrawal from the rescuer role disrupts the very structure of manipulation that previously gave others leverage over them. This does not mean the empath becomes cold or indifferent. On the contrary, their compassion deepens, but it is now intentional and self-respecting. Jung taught that wholeness is about conscious integration of all aspects of the psyche, including both empathy and self-preservation. By embracing this balance, the empath ensures that love is no longer a transactional tool or a vehicle for control. They give, but not to fill a void created by obligation or fear. They offer care because it is aligned with their values and energy, and because it does not demand self-sacrifice for validation. This maturation of the psyche also brings freedom. The empath is no longer entangled in cycles of overgiving, resentment, or manipulation. They no longer feel responsible for the redemption of others, and they no longer tolerate repeated harm in the name of loyalty or love. Their presence becomes steady, grounded, and resilient, a stark contrast to the reactive, emotionally overextended version of themselves that once existed. Narcissists and manipulators are often unsettled by this shift because they can no longer predict or control the empath through familiar patterns. Where they once relied on guilt, chaos, or obligation, they now encounter an unwavering boundary and an internally anchored self. This change is deeply uncomfortable for those who depend on the empath's compliance, but it is liberating for the empath. Jung described such moments as crucial points in individuation where the conscious self asserts its autonomy over unconscious habits and projections. By stepping out of the savior role, the empath reclaims energy, clarity, and emotional sovereignty. They become capable of engaging with others without being drained, of offering support without compromising integrity, and of creating relationships that are reciprocal rather than one-sided. This is not selfishness, it is self-possession. It is the natural consequence of a psyche that has stopped seeking validation through overgiving and started thriving through awareness. In leaving the savior role behind, the healed empath also models a new way of being, one that is compassionate, grounded, and balanced. Others are invited to take responsibility for themselves, not because the empath forces it, but because they no longer carry the emotional load on their behalf. This shift fundamentally changes the power dynamic in all relationships, dismantling unconscious control structures and creating a space where connection is authentic, conscious, and mutually respectful. Ultimately, stopping the savior role is both an act of liberation and a statement of inner strength. The healed empath is no longer anyone's emotional crutch, no longer bound by old expectations, and no longer a source of leverage for those who once relied on their overgiving. They have become whole, and in that wholeness, their presence commands respect, clarity, and quiet authority, leaving no room for manipulation, guilt, or coercion.